Hello, and welcome to episode 76 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Nick Soutrout. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Miriam Solomon, professor of philosophy at Temple University. Miriam's work has focused heavily on the philosophy of science, as well as issues that lie at the intersection of medicine and philosophy, epistemology, ethics, and gender. Miriam has written on a wide variety of other issues, including feminist radical empiricism, the intersection of feminism and Orthodox Judaism, and the work of Willard Quine. Her book, Social Empiricism, put forward a social account of scientific rationality that focuses on empirical success and finds dissent to be the normal state of scientific inquiry. Her second book, Making Medical Knowledge, explored the epistemological strengths and weaknesses of evidence-based medicine, medical consensus conferences, narrative medicine, and translational medicine. Miriam was recently awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for her project Evidence and Values in the DSM-5.X, in which she used tools from recent philosophy of science, science studies, and social epistemology to make recommendations for how to improve the ongoing process of revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders of the American Psychiatric Association. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Miriam. Dr. Miriam Solomon, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Thursday afternoon?
I'm very well, thank you, and I hope you too.
I'm doing quite well. Spring has sprung here in Atlanta, Georgia. How are things out in Pennsylvania?
Oh, it's a bright day, and the snowdrops are out.
Oh, really? Okay. So are you, is spring term in full swing there?
We're actually on spring break this week.
Oh, okay.
A rather early spring break, but no spring and no break. But
wow, that's interesting. Are you guys on the quarter system, or did you?
No, we're on the semester system.
Okay, just getting things early.
We've had 7 weeks, and we're going to have another 7 weeks.
Okay, so is it a truncated semester in some way? I guess. Okay.
No, it's not truncated at all. It's just that we always have spring break right in the middle.
Right. Fair enough. Okay. Well, that's good. Are you teaching anything interesting or enjoyable this term?
I am on sabbatical.
Oh, that's also wonderful as well. Oh, fantastic! So, what does one do with sabbatical during these times? What do you pour into old, research ideas that you'd been meaning to get to, explore new ideas? What have you found yourself up to?
Yes, it's a great time for research. It's also a good time for traveling, usually, although the pandemic has complicated that part of the sabbatical, being able to travel much. And travel to conferences and travel to be in different departments. So I'm not just talking about recreational travel.
Sure, like visiting visiting fellow at a department or overseas or something like that. Sure. Okay. Well, great. I bet, sabbatical during this time, definitely a little bit different. Hopefully it's been good and as good as it can be. Well, I'm very excited to get to know you a little bit better and to get to discuss your research. You had quite a career thus far in the philosophy of science. It seems to be, you seem to have a lot of different influence and interactions and just all over the place. And so why don't we just get started right away and go back a little bit to the beginning and hear a little bit about your where you came from. So Miriam, tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
I grew up in the United Kingdom. Some of those years were London, some were Liverpool, and some were Manchester. We moved quite a bit. My father was and is an Orthodox rabbi. And as he, climbed the rabbi track, he got better and better synagogues, and we moved around with him. So I'm not really a northerner or a southerner, although I would say I identify more strongly with the north of England, because that's where I spent most of my formative years.
For perhaps those of us who might not know, so what are the primary differences of between a northerner and a southerner?
Northerners are thought of as warmer. Southerners as somewhat colder and more unfriendly and more snobby. Of course, the North is also associated with the Industrial Revolution, and discoveries associated with that. And then with the unemployment after the decline of industry. So the North has been before. The Northwest in particular, which is where I was, Manchester and Liverpool, both those cities have interesting characters. And Liverpool in particular, everybody knows that's where the Beatles came from.
Right.
And I lived in Liverpool from about 1967 to about 1974. And I actually had not heard of the Beatles. I was kept in a small religious community, and we were not permitted to
listen to that kind of music at the time.
But I can report that I used to shop in Penny Lane and all of that.
Wow. I'm sure. So if you mention you were from Liverpool, I'm sure you get questions about the Beatles all the time or something like that. And yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. So grew up in with a pretty strong religious background. So how what was that like?
Well, it was very different from the upbringing of most people my age. We didn't have a television. And there were many things that we were not supposed to do or eat. Couldn't eat at other people's houses, couldn't eat at restaurants. And then there was the whole second education. So there was a secular education, and then there was a religious education. So a lot more hours of school and a lot more restrictions. And I was pretty sincere about it for most of that time. And when I had some religious doubts around the ages of 10 and 11, that's when my father introduced me to philosophy, and I found that really amazing. So that was how I got into philosophy, by reading Descartes and Berkeley.
And I've heard a little bit of some of this from other folks who have a bit of religious background, that when faced with arguments concerning the nature of religion, the nature of a god or something like that, that sometimes even the most hyper religious are some very encouraging of going to philosophy or exploring that. Oftentimes, maybe to further support evidence thus for or something like that, but maybe just also to explore deeper existential and religious ideas. So that's interesting.
My father was encouraging of it.
Okay, sure.
Much of the religious community does not encourage it, I would say, and it
Sure.
made my mother extremely nervous.
I see.
Most of the community, it was better not to ask questions.
I see. Okay, so founding philosophy quite early. So was that so right away reading Descartes at around 10 or 11 was was that the big switch into getting into philosophy? Was that or did you have other interests at the time connected?
I never thought at that age that philosophy would be something that I would do for a career. Yeah. I naturally gravitated towards the sciences, and I was good at them without really trying. I thought I would become a wife and mother primarily, because that's when I grew up, and that's what was expected of me. So I wasn't really thinking of a career. Extent that I thought of a career, it was mostly maybe I could be a school teacher. I did like science and medicine, so it was also, maybe I could be a nurse. I did voice the interest in being a doctor at one point, and that was promptly squashed by my mother. So, career was not a big thing. I was aware of women's lib, as we called it back then. Mm-hmm. And I kind of liked it. And in my case, I interpreted it as a resource for criticizing my parents for making me do domestic work while my brothers got off scot-free.
Right.
So I do remember that. But I think at a deep level, I internalized those goals and those wishes. And I expected to be, a mother of many children by the time I was in my mid-20s. And for my primary occupation to be a homemaker.
So how did okay, so I can certainly understand those expectations, and so how did they come to be, and did you see a change? So I know, looking a little bit about your background, you ended up going to Cambridge, study the natural sciences, and so was this something that was encouraged by family, or in the context of then going to university, was it something where you were thinking, okay, I'm going to go study, develop my education, but then return home, or do kind of create some sort of dynamic that is sort of expected of me, or what were you thinking at the time?
I didn't have a long-term plan. In my last 2 years of high school, which were in London, I discovered, with the help of some really talented teachers, that I was actually quite smart. And the things that I was learning in biology and in physics and in math were truly exciting me. And I just wanted to do more of them. Applying for what used to be called Oxbridge entrance is a fair amount of work. Mm-hmm. And I found myself eager to do it. my mother was not keen on my going to university away from home. But actually, my father, who had not been raised Orthodox and had gone to Cambridge himself, thought it was a very cool idea. So I went against my mother's wishes. She was afraid that I would lose my faith and assimilate. She was also afraid that with all my interests in things like astrophysics, I was not going to be able to take the book of Genesis that seriously anymore. I got to Cambridge as a scientist, and my religious questions continued. And, I thought I would find a whole group of people who would be kind of like me and want to ask these big questions. But for the most part, I did not. I went to the Jewish Society, and people there were very comfortable in their lifestyle, weren't asking too many questions. And so although I had friends, I wasn't having the late night philosophy talks that so many people find transformative in college settings.
Right.
And I thought, what could I do while I was at Cambridge to get more philosophy? And I could have switched to the philosophy tripos, but that would have meant just doing philosophy, no more science. And I thought a safer bet would be to add history and philosophy of science to one of my classes. And that's what I ended up doing. And I liked it so much that in the third year, I just did history and philosophy of science. I would say that at that time I was working my way out of science. I thought I would get further and further because my next idea was, well, I better learn some more philosophy, not just philosophy of science, because then I'll be able to address the religious questions. So I went to Harvard for my PhD, and I did address the religious questions. It took a couple of years. I lost my faith.
What were these questions, if you don't mind me asking?
Is there a God?
Fair enough.
That was the biggest one. Is there a God? Because I felt that everything followed from the existence of God, that my life made sense if God existed and made no sense if he didn't, because I was following all these abstruse practices that I did not enjoy. And there was no point to me of doing them unless God wanted them.
Right. So, wow. So in terms of, how does one, at that level work out those kinds of questions? Did it, come from individually reading and thinking through things? Did it come with, working with advisors or other students or other peers, or maybe a combination of everything?
A combination of all of those things. And I would say perhaps the thing that was most important for me was peers. And when I got to graduate school, I found peers who, although, God wasn't their main question, had a main question. That is, they were driven to do philosophy because they thought it was going to make a difference to how they lived. And they took it very seriously. It wasn't just a fun intellectual game. And they became my community, and I felt much closer to them than I did to, the Jewish Orthodox community at the Harvard Hillel.
Fair enough. So, exploring these deep questions, and I imagine, so in some ways they seem somewhat, not necessarily directly related to philosophy of science questions, but I'm not sure how much you brought, so they're kind of they're certainly meaningful and certainly big questions. But so in doing and going into Harvard, what was your time at Harvard like? What did you get into? How did your way of thinking about philosophy and thinking about science, or just thinking about how you wanted to connect yourself and your life with philosophy, how did that change during that time?
Harvard had a huge impact, and interestingly, although I thought that I would probably write a dissertation in philosophy of science, the two people who were there then, Hilary Putnam and Israel Schaffler, were neither of them interested in philosophy of science anymore. And philosophy of science courses weren't really offered. So that was a little surprising to me, but it was okay. I was planning, in any case, to spend a lot of time on questions of skepticism, just general M&E questions that I thought were very closely related to my questions about faith. And the faculty member who's most involved in students with those interests was Burton Drebin. Mm-hmm. And he was a strong influence, although a mixed influence. He, at bottom level, he believed that philosophy was nonsense. He sided with that interpretation of the later Wittgenstein. And so he thought it was all language on holiday, and that philosophical problems weren't real problems, and they were created by misuse of language, as well as by psychodynamic concerns. So in that way, he was a little deeper than somebody like J.L. Austin, who just sounds like he's telling you that you're making grammar mistakes when you get into philosophical questions. But Drebin would say, "Oh, you're moved by a metaphysical, desire of one kind or another, or you're moved by epistemic anxiety." And so he basically thought that philosophical problems were emotional problems, and that everybody with any philosophical aptitude was highly neurotic. And maybe it would have been better if he hadn't decided I was one of the neurotic ones, but he certainly decided I was in the club. He played favorites with students, mm-hmm. and gave me a lot of attention at a time when I appreciated it. But it came with strings attached. And I say this because most people I've heard talk about grad school careers have said wonderful things about their advisors. And I just want to put it out there that not all advisors are wonderful.
And I see.
And certainly back then, there was very little that could be done about an unprofessional advisor. It was one of the hardest things I did to actually get through the program. For the first 3 years of the program, he was unfailingly helpful.
Right.
What turned it was, first of all, when I left religion, he preferred it for me to be in religion and tortured about it. But I started writing. He preferred me not to be able to write because he could never write. He himself never got a PhD. And yeah, he preferred that I would not work on what I ended up working on, which was the work of the philosopher Quine, who I was attracted to because Quine was such a secular philosopher and such a scientistic philosopher. There wasn't a religious bone in Quine's body, and it appealed to me at that time. I wanted to see how far you could go with it. Quine was still alive, although he was retired. And I met him a few times, and that was great. But Bert Drabin didn't want me to write on Quine because he felt that he was the authority on Quine, and it was his property.
Wow.
So there was quite a bit of struggle over that.
So how at the time did you, I mean, this sounds like a particularly absolutely troubling situation. How did you address and what did you do and how did you go about making sure that you could be successful in what you needed in doing what you needed to do?
Well, I had very supportive friends. I have an immense amount of determination if I want to do something. I asked Hilary Putnam if he would be on the committee as well, because I thought that Bert Drabin might behave a little better. Hilary Putnam.
Wow.
Which is correct. That was a good move. And I actually thought that I wanted to get my PhD and then go to medical school. But I was very determined to finish what I'd started.
Right.
Because I'd answered my questions about God. Why stay in philosophy?
There was the big ones that were keeping you up at night. So there, yeah. Well, okay. Well, so successfully made it through the PhD. Despite not a particularly very problematic advisor. Did he end up? I mean, what happened? Did he go on to continue to advise students? Was this just?
He came to a sticky end, not as sticky as he deserved. But he was accused of sexual harassment by a former secretary in the department, and also of embezzlement. Harvard, of course, did not want any sexual harassment on their books, so they encouraged him to plead guilty to the embezzlement, which he did, and they fired him. And then BU and fired him.
Wow.
So, I know that he did come to an end, and it was because of his behavior. Right. And I don't want to give the impression that he was, quote, just a sexual harasser.
Right.
He did not sexually harass me, at least not in severe ways. He did harass me.
Right.
He crossed a lot of boundaries.
Absolutely. But I think,
there are people out there like that still. So, if any grad student is listening to this and has a problematic advisor, I really encourage them to get all the help they can.
I appreciate you sharing your story. I think something that happens with early career folks is it's sort of, there's a lot of pressure to want to perform, or there's a lot of incentive to want to, for whatever, make it through the program, get good letters of recommendation, have someone ready to make those phone calls for you. And then sometimes it's, like people don't, plenty of times people either feel trapped, they don't know what they can or cannot do, and then perhaps even take the position of, well, I've made it through, so now I'm good. Or I'm just going to leave it at that without addressing it. I think people are, from what I've heard, I've spoken with folks with, who have had issues with advisors, and they seem to be addressing things a little bit better, but it's not like it's gone away. Like, I think it's probably better than it has been, but those kinds of people are still, in power, and there's just certain dynamics that, we'll hope that will, improve over time. But, the more there are resources and like climate committees with departments or, external ways to go about addressing climate issues. I think that I'm starting to see that more and more in departments. I'm not sure if that's the case at Temple now, but I imagine, and of course it's probably even, obviously I'm following the news about Harvard, and there's just, I imagine particularly at some of the very big institutions, it's, probably further problematic in different kinds of ways. But thank you. And it's very encouraging to hear of success, but also the re-encouragement of those to take issue. Well, I'm very happy to hear that, it sounds to me like, also, some very, so you're off to medical school, right? Is that the,
there was a snag. The snag was that, I was not a U.S. citizen and I did not have a green card. So I couldn't apply for loans. That was the snag.
Dang.
So I thought, okay, well, then I guess I need to look for a tenure-track job in philosophy, because that's the best way to get a green card.
Okay.
Other than marriage. And that wasn't in the offing.
Fair
So
enough.
I went on the job market, and I got a tenure-track job at the University of Cincinnati. That was my first job.
Oh.
And I was very fortunate in many ways to get that job. They wanted a young person in the department. They hadn't been able to hire for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And they really didn't care what I worked on. They didn't say, we hope you will continue working on quine or working in philosophy. They didn't hire me to do anything narrow. They said, we're glad to have you. Please flourish.
That's wonderful.
And several of them took an interest in me. They had a Friday afternoon discussion group when we didn't have a colloquium, where we would read a recent paper. And I would go along to those meetings. I was always the only woman. And we would have long discussions over recent articles in philosophy. And I got the training I didn't get in grad school. Harvard was very focused on the history of analytic.
Right.
Not on analytic itself. Because it thought that nonsense was nonsense. Analytic philosophy is nonsense. The history of nonsense is
something. least we can. No, that's, I mean, so it's it's a different
so
tool.
I
Different
wasn't
tool.
very familiar with analytic philosophy, or with contemporary analytic philosophy, I should say. I was thoroughly familiar with Frege through Quine. And I just found myself getting interested in epistemological questions, and it was the time that Tversky and Kahneman material were first being discussed, and the challenges to rationality were very interesting to me. I just started by writing a few different things, not knowing what direction I was going into, mostly in the area of epistemology. But one of the questions that exercised me was how do scientists think? Not just how do all of us think, but how do scientists think? Are scientists just as susceptible to the kinds of biases that Tversky and Kahneman talked about? And if so, what does that mean for the rationality of science? And so I found myself drifting back into science, partly through philosophy of psychology, but partly some of my old interests. And I did an NEH Summer Institute that was, I think, called Science in Context in 1990. And it caught me up with everything that I had missed for, the last 10 years, for the previous 10 years that have been going on in philosophy of science and science studies more generally. Because when I got to Harvard, I was not doing that material. And the NEH Summer Institute, we read Chapin and Schaeffer and the beginnings of feminist philosophy of science. And I just fell in love with it all over again, and decided I really wanted to move back into philosophy of science. That it seemed to me that it was richer and more interesting than some of the epistemology metaphysics questions, and that some of the questions were not just neurotic misuses of language. Those were real questions. Now, I left Cincinnati about that time, not because I didn't like Cincinnati. I really did like it as a department. But I found living in the Midwest very challenging. This is before the internet and everything. And, Cincinnati is, as they say, a very family town, and
sure.
Procter and Gamble is the main industry, and most people my age were working for Procter and Gamble. I was single. I felt really lonely there. I just couldn't find a community, and so I started looking to get back to the East Coast or somewhere where there'd be more people like me. And that was when I got the Temple job. I first had a visiting year at Penn that was on a Mellon Fellowship, which I just took leave from Cincinnati. But while I was here that year, I got a job at Temple. And the year at Penn was terrific. I spent a lot of time hanging around both cognitive scientists and historians and sociologists of science there, kind of further deepening my interest in that kind of work. And I took the Temple job not because it was a better job than Cincinnati. It was pretty much a lateral move, and I knew that the department at Temple was not as easygoing as the one in Cincinnati, but I wanted to move city.
Understand.
And I've been here now for 30 years. So made my career here.
Fantastic. And quite the career you have. I'm going through this ginormous CV of articles and plenty of excellent work. And I know, so at one, you share a little bit about, so your first monograph, listed here, titled Social Empiricism. And so you started to mention some of how, those questions that related to, the way in which scientists think. And could you tell us a little bit about how did this book come about, and what were some of your main, your main takeaways or arguments in this?
Well, social empiricism came about in response to my worries about how scientists think and whether scientists fall into the sorts of errors that Tversky and Kahneman talked about. So, scientists have biased reasoning of one kind or another. In what sense are they engaged in an objective enterprise? And I think the biggest claim in that book is that assessments of objectivity need to be from the point of view of the community as a whole, and not from the point of view of any one individual in the community. So to take a very simple example, if a scientist picks working on a particular theory because it reminds him of a game he played when he was 5 years old, and another scientist works on another theory because it reminds him of a game he played when he was 10 years old. Their reasons for choosing to work on these theories aren't, quote, rational, but both theories get to be worked on. And from the perspective of wanting a division of cognitive labor, that's fine. So really, I was asking the question, what do the biases do as a whole? Do they just help distribute cognitive labor, in which case they're fine? Or do they make scientists hold on to theories that are just no good?
Sure.
Do they do that? And I became very interested in the narrative of the basically Kuhnian narrative of going from consensus to disagreement to consensus again. And the assumption that seemed to me to be in the philosophical literature and also in the historical literature that consensus was an endpoint and was a good place to be, and that dissent was not. And I wrote a lot about why I didn't think that was the case and why, if anything, we have a little bit too much consensus.
Oh, interesting. What could result from what accounts for the excess of consensus, according to your thinking?
Well, there are a lot of structural features of the scientific community that encourage people to comply, go along with their education, their training, what's thought to be promising by the community. there's a lot of resistance to outsider ideas, at least at the beginning. And there's this feeling that people have that we're trying to find the truth, and so we can't all be right if we disagree. So let's try to settle on one thing. And that would be great if it did mean you settle on the truth, but obviously it doesn't. You can settle on something that omits an enormous amount of stuff. And so, I realize it's better to have a bunch of different theories where each has some successes and some partial truths, than have everybody artificially come to agreement on one theory and where they would lose all the benefits of the others.
Very good point.
So I spent a lot of time trying to break that Kuhnian narrative and break the idea that consensus was a mark of maturity. That's what Kuhn said it was.
But
he said it was a mark of a mature science.
That's I can definitely see, and I'm sure they're get into some cases or some interesting aspects, but that's absolutely right. And so I see I'm tracing a little bit of your work here. And so it seems like a lot of your work has then continued along the lines of understanding what rationality in science, or what makes scientific knowledge. And I know your next work, and turning toward medicine, has to do with understanding. It's titled "Making Medical Knowledge." Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about then essentially the next stage? And I'm sorry if I'm sort of skipping over some probably very interesting parts, but how did your thinking? It's not. So I've been talking to a lot of early career folks, so they're like in phase one. So how did your thinking then start to transform? From having worked on these social dimensions to then perhaps going toward a focus in a particular science, that is medicine, or if you want to call it a science, and thinking about these kinds of questions in that realm.
Well, first of all, there is a direction my work has gone, which is in the direction of increased application. And, starting in epistemology, moving to philosophy of science, moving to philosophy of medicine, and more applied science. And now my interest in philosophy of psychiatry. I didn't consciously choose that line, but it's gone. And my interest in the social epistemology of medicine came up when I was asked to participate in a consensus conference on the surgery of trauma. And, I've been saying in my book all the time that consensus wasn't such a great thing. Mm-hmm. And maybe we have too much of it. So I was very intrigued by this medical tradition that has been going since the 70s of convening experts and making consensus statements. And I naively expected everybody to have different views and then spend 3 days around a table all coming to agreement. And it wasn't like that at all.
Wow.
That was a very naive thing to think anyway, because as somebody else put it, not me, she refers to consensus consensus as GOBSAT, good old boys sitting around a table. Why should sitting around the table talking to each other really be doing any science? Why, when scientists disagree, they typically do more experiments. So, we don't have a consensus conference on string theory.
Right.
There are only a few things we have consensus conferences on. One is climate change. And the other is medicine and some other forms of technology. What they have in common is that they're things for which there needs to be joint action.
Yeah. Yeah, I was immediately... go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
No, I happened to have been I shared before, my issues are also in philosophy of medicine, particularly philosophy of psychiatry. And so I've actually been interviewing a few folks who have been on certain committees of the DSM, Diagnostic Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders. And it's very much, the early versions were a lot of good old boys sitting around a table or in somebody's basement discussing the literature. But you're right, because as you've mentioned, and I think that's really unique that's really neat that you've gotten to kind of make sense essentially of what it is that, what are these defining features of why it is, I suppose, certain like climate science, medicine, and certain technologies. What is it that is similar about these particular sciences or that require a consensus? And so, yeah, that's been fascinating. It's been interesting and fascinating to me too, and kind of to what to make of this kind of knowledge and what to make of, either if you want to say values or other facets that are important and are requiring of this sort of consensus. So sure. I'm just familiar with it. It's fascinating to me because in other aspects, part of me is thinking, well, this isn't how science works, or like this shouldn't be how science works. Like I feel like it should take a little bit more time, but then again, sometimes time is not what you have, and you need to make action. You need to take action and make decisions. So, yeah.
You need to take action. The other thing that it's good for is making authoritative claims. So if a professional body shows unanimity, it comes over as very authoritative. And if they disagree among themselves, then they tend to lose authority, and room is then there for others to come in claiming that they know better. So the other question to ask about these consensus conferences is, why have them in a time of evidence-based medicine? And I did notice that the evidence-based medicine hierarchies have expert opinion right at the bottom. So that started me off in what's going on here? Are we going to stop doing consensus conferences because we're now in an age of evidence-based medicine? And what I then saw was that there was a new phenomenon, translational medicine, coming up. And there was always a reaction to scientific approaches to medicine in terms of people who claim that there's an art as well as a science of medicine. And that literature was growing with things like narrative medicine. So I wanted to write a book on what all this meant about what was going on in medicine and how we know in medicine.
Right around this time, I would say, I'm not sure of the particular historical trend of evidence-based medicine, but I imagine it prompted a lot of thought from a lot of philosophers of science and philosophers of medicine to make sense of, okay, here we have this new almost paradigm or this new way of thinking about the way medical knowledge is taken out. What are we to make of it? What are we to do? And does it change things? I'm sure there's lots of different applications to splice evidence-based medicine. How does it impact X and Y things? So, yeah, fascinating. So, thank you for sharing a little bit about that. Perhaps for my own personal interest, I think it's great that you're interested in philosophy of psychiatry. I've looked at the advancement for Association for the Advancement for Philosophy of Science and philosophy of psychiatry and other parts, and I've seen your name come up a number of times. And so perhaps could you tell us a little, so for his, historically, philosophy of psychiatry has not really been a thing as much, in terms of as a prominent, it's not necessarily like in terms of saying what you do in terms of philosophy of science, it's down the line, a narrow focus, but it's starting to broaden a little bit more. And we're starting to see conferences come up, and more and more folks find interests in the questions. So perhaps maybe first a general view of why do you think philosophers of science, perhaps, and you could just tell from your experience, why are philosophers of science turning toward these kinds of questions now, as I said, for a narrow focus? And then what are some of those questions that are interesting to you?
What I do see is that there are a lot of new philosophers of psychiatry coming in. There's a very healthy younger generation. And I think they're bringing those questions in with them. It's not like they're going somewhere where there's some famous philosopher of psychiatry and finding themselves working in that. I think they're bringing those questions for the most part. There already was this organization, the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. And that goes back a long time. I've only been associated with it for about 3 years. It goes back a long time, and it's about 50% philosophers and about 50% psychiatrists. Whether or not that will continue into the newer generations, I don't know. But we're just in an age when we're much more aware of mental health. So that's a part of it. Of the interest. I don't know whether, here I can only speculate, whether the DSM have made people start thinking about psychiatric disorders, or whether it's the Mad Pride movement, or the atypical neurological movement, what it is. But it could be any of those.
Sure.
I was, again, sort of accidentally drawn in when Ken Kendler invited me to one of his conferences, and I didn't know anything about the DSM process, and then I, discovered what a consensus process it is, and became very interested in it. I also then, developed deeper thinking about some psychiatric conditions that I'd always been interested in, like Asperger's, which is not a disorder. But the move to take it out of the DSM-5 was something I looked at very closely.
Yeah, I can see. I see you have a couple papers on schizophrenia, autism. A number of really, either particular issues related to particular disorders, and then also just some more general issues on concepts. And so I noticed perhaps maybe your most recent work and articles either that have just very recently come out or that are going to come out has to do with the concepts of psychiatric disorders. So what are some of the issues that you see related to either, and I haven't read these papers, so forgive me. So do they have to do with just the big general concept of psychiatric disorders, or what's going on there in terms of your thinking on these on psychiatric disorder?
I don't think we have a very good concept of psychiatric disorder. We don't have a good concept of physical illness either. Those are two general questions that maybe exercise the field of philosophy of medicine and philosophy of psychiatry for some time. And, people came up with definitions, and then people came up with counterexamples and so on. And, but I see it as a rich area, because what philosophers typically do is they use their intuitions to answer these questions of, is something a disorder or is it not a disorder? But all kinds of theoretical claims can be behind those intuitions, and some of them should be challenged. And I started thinking about grief as a phenomenon, and grief was taken out. The grief exclusion was taken out of the DSM-5. So the question is, if you are grieving, are you depressed? Because you have the symptoms of depression.
Right.
And most people say, oh, no, grieving is completely normal. You're not depressed. And that always struck me kind of odd. Why does making it normal mean that it's not a disorder?
An interesting question.
So and you see people saying we shouldn't stigmatize grief, or we shouldn't medicalize grief, or we shouldn't treat grief with a pill.
Right.
Because that shows, how we lack humanity. We just think that people are disposable, so you can take a pill so you forget it. And I thought that was all very strange stuff to say. It seems to me that depression is usually triggered by loss, and bereavement isn't the only kind of loss that triggers depression. Many different kinds of loss trigger depression. So if you're going to say that grief is not depression, then maybe you should say these other kinds of loss are not depression either. That's one way you could go.
Sure.
Or you could say they're all depression.
So is this I'm sorry. I just wanted to mention that. So was this the kind of work that was awarded to you in terms of your Guggenheim Fellowship of recent? Was this the kind of, or was this?
Guggenheim was for the earlier work on DSM changes on the how to change.
Gotcha. Okay.
This is
more current.
This is my pandemic project.
Oh, great.
This is what
grief. It's such a wonderful, it's a timely, yeah.
Guggenheim was cut short. I was at Cambridge. I was having a fabulous time. My first time back in many years. And when I came back, I had to cancel so much. And I thought, what could I work on that I wouldn't have had time to work on otherwise? And it was this feeling that the concept of psychiatric disorder, everyone thinks psychiatric grief is normal. So here we have something's normal that's a disorder. And I embrace that. And what I did to try to help it go down better was suggest that it be thought of as psychological injury. And thought of on analogy to physical injury. So we don't stigmatize physical injury, and
so maybe you wouldn't
treatment. and so on and so forth. And as for the suggestion that you could take a pill and your grief would go away, that doesn't work, so, and it doesn't work for a lot of things. So we're not really in this kind of 1984, take a pill and you'll feel this, that, and the other situation.
No. No, that's fascinating. And yeah, I'm sure, if it was someone who's definitely in tune with the way in which consensus building happens, there's all kinds of interesting debates in the DSM, one with grief, one with I'm interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, other obviously autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's. And there should be a text. It's the DSM-5 TR will be coming out pretty soon. It'll be interesting to see kind of what happens with that. But it's obviously evolving and ongoing. And then, also then, in some ways, it's also existing. How do you take the knowledge of the DSM or the authoritative claims that are making the DSM in the context of then a competing book of work, the ICD-11 or the so you have two groups of text, two authoritative bodies, I don't know, like what I've been thinking about, like what kind of how to make sense of people. A lot of times it's clinicians and practicing clinicians, but scientists kind of almost picking and choosing which conceptions to go on or which they like a little bit more of. Does that present any, I don't know, challenges or ways of thinking about things where you don't just have the one, but you really, in this case, you just have two. And so.
Well, we're actually in a much richer situation than even that. I wondered about the DSM and the ICD, but these days, the same people are doing both of them. There's not that much difference between them.
Right.
It's true that the ICD is written for a worldwide application. So there are some things that an American framework are just inappropriate for. But really, the overlap between DSM and ICD is pretty high.
Right.
And it's high not because they're both converging on the truth, but because
of course
the same people are on committees. The challenges at the moment are coming from things like RDoC,
right?
Coming from the NIH, and then there's a system called hierarchical.
HiTop. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Well, I forgot what it was.
From
psychologists rather than psychiatrists,
right.
And looks to be a really interesting way of classifying diseases in a way that relates them to each other.
Yeah.
DSM doesn't have a tree of how everything's related. And I've also become interested in the network models that Denny Boersma is talking about. So I think we're in a pretty pluralistic situation right now in psychiatry, and I think that's good.
I think so too. And then when I've spoken to psychologists themselves, they're all familiar. I mean, they've heard of these network models. They've heard, a lot of it because they're coming from psychologists, but they're not, it's pretty interesting to see psychologists and psychiatrists and philosophers of science all thinking about these things, and almost the psychologists leading the way in terms of conceptual change. Obviously it's their discipline.
It's nice to see the psychologists taking some lead here, because psychiatry has been very dominant and very authoritative. And still in the United States, they do not have patients in on their deliberations. In Europe now they do, and they're called experts by experience. But the resistance of the American Psychiatric Association to allow any of those crazy patients in has been really quite surprising.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on your current work. Obviously, I could keep talking about this. I'm very interested, but we've gone a little bit over time. Why don't we jump to the last question that many guests have answered, which and so I'm curious, what do you take, Miriam, to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
This is a super hard question. I certainly think that there's a challenge facing all of academia, and philosophy and philosophy of science are a part of that. And that's probably our greatest challenge. It's not specific to philosophy of science, but it's specific to all of the humanities and social sciences. So I worry about that a good deal. In other ways, I find myself hoping that philosophy of science will continue to be taught in interdisciplinary programs. And I don't know how much that will happen. So like a history and philosophy of science department, which you're part of, I think that's terrific. Like science studies at UC San Diego, that's very good. I think philosophy of science is best done in an interdisciplinary manner, with the science that it's about, but also with other perspectives on those sciences. I've tried for quite some time to build science studies here at Temple, and it's been truly challenging. You would think that interdisciplinary study would be easier these days because people talk about it, but actually, in terms of the ways that universities are organized, and particularly the responsibility-centered management and those sorts of financial arrangements, it's very hard to do collective tasks like that. It's very hard to teach across schools, so I would have to collaborate with people in the College of Science and Technology, the College of Education, and the College of Media Studies to put together science studies. And the deans in those colleges don't want to collaborate because they don't want to lose whatever. So I think that's challenging, the structure.
So what kind of incentives would a university need to have a science studies program or to have an HPS? I feel, perhaps a little bit privileged coming from or being in a program where it seems like there is a lot of excitement. I'm not sure how much of that's coming from the top down, where, the president or the dean of the university, or this is something that's, because there's a lot of programs. We have there's a cognitive science program that connects things like informatics, psychology, neuroscience, and then it has a standalone, you can do a dual PhD in that. And then that's kind of the biggest one. But there's just, I don't know, there's definitely, at the same time, there's also there's a cog sci program, but then there's always there's always the interdisciplinary or the super specialty programs are always under threat, basically, of getting maybe necessary. I guess cog sci is a little bit different, but so maybe perhaps, I don't know, is there something that universities, or maybe not universities, but program heads could do? Like, so what I'm seeing, also another question is, the thing is, folks perhaps like myself or others coming from, perhaps they're graduating from Temple under your, studying with you, or they've coming out of Pitt or UC Irvine or something. They're all getting placed at, places without any philosophy of science. They're the only philosopher of science in the department.
Yeah.
But they've come from this history of working with scientists, hanging out in different departments, getting grants to do these really cool interdisciplinary things. And so they have big ideas, and you see like I think it's at University of Texas, Dallas, like Matt Brown doing the Values in Science Institute, right? That I'm pretty sure, that didn't just come out of a dean's head. That was something that they said, we need this we need this program here that has specialty or thing. And so I actually have a lot of hope, I think, for the future, in that it's going to take the early career folks to say, when they get plopped at the University of Idaho, okay, we need X, Y, and Z, and we're not just going, and, there will still probably just be those more traditional analytic philosophy departments that here's the philosophy of science, here's this, but I don't know. I guess I just see a lot of good things happening, or perhaps maybe this is a little bit of a selection bias because I'm only talking to those people who are bringing those things on at Virginia and at, University of Kentucky. And so, but yeah, I mean, what does a professor need? What does the college need to make these programs succeed?
Yeah, I think the answer is different for different colleges, and I think there's an awful lot you can do, I can do, without creating programs that's interdisciplinary and so on. I've had a number of collaborations with scientists that have come about fortuitously. Scientists at my own institution, scientists at other institutions. And, you don't need an official structure to do that. We do have an informal STS network at Temple now that is a network of faculty. We can call ourselves a network. Nobody needs to sign any forms for that. And right. So we meet every month and somebody talks about the work. And that's led to some collaborations. Making it relevant to the leadership of the university, we're trying to do that. Ethics is always a good selling point.
Yes.
So if you can stress bioethics or the IRB stuff, or providing ethics courses that are required for various science programs. All of that is a way of making philosophy useful. But philosophy can offer so much more than that, and science studies right. can offer so much more than that. I certainly resisted becoming pigeonholed, as I could have been, as an ethicist at Temple, because I volunteer on the hospital ethics committee, and I was in favor of creating a bioethics center. But it's a bit of a trap. What it means is that you are seen as kind of humanizing or civilizing the medical students, rather than giving them a set of critical tools that will help them challenge medical knowledge and so on. If you look at most medical schools, they have bioethics departments or humanities departments, medical humanities departments. And the medical humanities departments are all about the warm and fuzzy stuff, and let's write poetry and analyze art and so on. And there's nothing wrong with doing those things. It's just that there's so much more that can be done. So I certainly feel that being a professor of philosophy allows me to do all of these things because of the comforts of tenure and because I'm not expected to run a medical education program where I would be pushed to do certain things and not other things.
Fair enough. So perhaps the resistance going to that is, I could see the counterpoint to not necessarily, being careful and selective of the kinds of programs you want to be in and or are deciding to sell or create. And I came from definitely familiar with those ethics community. We see a lot of engineering ethics programs nowadays, perhaps more so for like the education in like the computer science and engineering and AI ethics is, very, very big and I think there's a lot of really great philosophers of science who are now focusing on some of those, machine ethics and things like that. So very cool stuff there, and maybe even in that realm, it's not so, there isn't quite the history and the pull of perhaps a medical humanities program as you described in that kind of field, but I'm not sure. Anyway, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm sorry to have gone over, but I was really enjoying the conversation. And so, I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about your story, your history. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, shout out, to promote before we go?
I know, but I want to wish you well, and I hope I'll see you at one of the conferences.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm very much looking forward to Crosby. I would love to meet you in person. I'm sure at one of these philosophy of psychiatry meetings, I'll definitely be a lookout. I'll drop you a note and be sure to say hello. All right. Well, have a good rest of your Thursday and enjoy Philadelphia. All right. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.